Hello and welcome to the next video in the series about the Open Digital Architecture Canvas. In this video I'm going to share a deep dive on how the authentication and authorization works with the ODA canvas. I'm going to answer three questions. So the first is, what is the scope of an ODA component versus the ODA canvas with respect to authentication and authorization? How does the canvas get permission to call management and security APIs on a component? And also, how does a component define the roles that it supports for external systems as well as other components to access its services? Now, with the ODA canvas, each ODA component includes a declarative definition of its requirements for roles and permissions. The component does not implement any identity management solution, but instead relies on an identity service to be available in the canvas. Now, this is a big change from our traditional application architecture. So in our current environment, many applications will include identity management as part of their implementation because they have to, because they're built as standalone applications. But we're setting to get away from that in the canvas. We're setting to have a single identity management solution and have components that can be lightweight because they are just declaring their requirements for identity management and not having to actually implement their own identity management solution as part of their implementation. Now, a Canvas platform can use any identity management solution that can support the OAuth 2 standard services, and identity config operators automate the configuration of the identity management systems using roles and permissions that are mastered in the component. And in our reference canvas, we have identity config operators for Keycloak and also for Microsoft Azure Entra ID. Now, in this video, I'm going to use the Keycloak open source identity management solution, but it's just a demonstration, and the same concept should apply for whatever identity management solution you're using. So the first thing is, when I install the base canvas, and I have Keycloak as part of my installation, what happens is the installation will include a CanvasSystem user, which is called a client in Keycloak. And the idea is, when the canvas is calling any services, it does it as this CanvasSystem user. So if the canvas is calling management or security APIs on a component, it will use this CanvasSystem user. And when I deploy a component, it declares the role to be applied to this CanvasSystem user to give it authorization to call its APIs. So the CanvasSystem user needs to be given permission to call the APIs on a given component, and that's done because the component actually declares it as part of its component specification. And there's an identity config operator that takes that definition or that declaration, and it'll configure it and go into Keycloak and grant that role to the CanvasSystem user. And the component can also declare other roles that can be granted to other clients. So this could be external systems or other internal components. And these roles can be static as part of the component specification, or they could be dynamic and exposed by the component using an API. So I'm going to demonstrate this by I'm going to go into a local canvas which I have installed on my machine here, and you see at the moment it's got no components running in it, and I'm going to do a Helm install of a component which is using static roles as part of its definition, and I'm just going to go and show the YAML definition for this component. And if I look at the YAML definition here within the security function, you can see it's defined some component roles. So these are roles you could apply to external systems or to other components to grant them permission to call the APIs. And this is the role that's given to the CanvasSystem user. So the CanvasSystem user has permission to call the APIs. It'll take just a few minutes for this component to be deployed. In fact, it's just completed. So if I go and have a look in Keycloak, we can see what's happened. So if by logging to Keycloak. The first thing I'm going to do is just to show there was this CanvasSystem user installed, and this was installed as part of the installation of the canvas. And then have a look in my clients. You can see it's created a client for the component that I just installed, is R1 Product Catalog Management component. And within that client, you should see there should be a set of roles that it's created in Keycloak. And so these are the roles. So these were the roles I designed to be shared with other external systems or other components. And this is the role which should be applied to that CanvasSystem user. And I can just go and check that that's happened. So if I go to the CanvasSystem user, I should be able to see that yes, that CanvasSystem user has been granted that admin role on top of this R1 Product Catalog Management component. So it's all good. Now, as well as being able to grant roles to the canvas, I can also grant some of these roles to external clients. So I have an external client, I can grant it a role onto this component, and I can also grant it to internal, which would be granting it to other components to call. So I'm going to deploy in a second component and give it a release name FC, and I can grant that second component permission to call APIs by granting it one of the roles from this component. So let me go and do that. So first I'm going to install that FC component. I'm just going to show this component. It's using the dynamic declaration of its roles. I'm just going to quickly show that. So here within the security function, the role to add to the CanvasSystem user has to be statically defined because it doesn't have permission to call APIs until it has that first role. But then other roles that this component is offering, it's making available by implementing a TM-Form Open API. And effectively the canvas will call this API and it will listen for any updates. So you can dynamically and continuously through the life cycle of that component, you can dynamically add or remove or update the roles, and they'll automatically be configured in Keycloak. And this would be the typical thing you'd have with something like a product catalog, where during the lifetime of the catalog, you might want to add, for example, an MVNO user, which would only have authorization to view a subset of the products and offers within a product management component. And that's also complete. And I'm going to go into Keycloak and show how I would grant firstly an external system a role on that component, and then secondly how I'd grant that second component a role on the first component. Now in Keycloak, if I want to create an external system using the client authentication flow, I have to create that as a client. So I'm going to go in here and I can say create client, and I'm going to give it a name of external system, and I'm going to switch on this client authentication flow. Now in Keycloak, to grant it a role is actually a two-step process. Firstly, I create a client scope. This is almost like a grouping of roles, and then I attach that client scope to this external system user. And this is something specific to Keycloak. Other identity management solutions might have something similar. And you can consider it almost like a client scope being a business role which you can assign technical roles into, and it makes it easier to then assign that same business role to multiple clients. So I'm going to go and create a client scope, and I'm going to call it catalog 1 scope, and I can in this client scope I can then assign a role, and these roles I'm going to look by clients, and I'm going to look for role on this R1 product catalog management component, and I want to grant it this cat1 owner role. So it's a role which has been defined by the R1 product catalog management component, and I'm going to assign that into this catalog 1 scope. And then Now that I've done that, I can go into my external system user and I can basically attach that client scope. So that client scope now, which includes the role, I'm going to add to my external system. So that's it. So I've now granted that external system a role, and what I would do with an external system, I'd have to then look at the client ID in secret and somehow pass the client ID in secret onto the operations team for that external system, and they could then they'd call through the OAuth client authentication flow, and they'd get a token, and then they'd be able to call the APIs on my component, and the component would say, yes, I'm being called by a user which has a role which I defined, and that role was called cat1 role, and so I know what they'd have authorization to do and what data they're authorized to see within my component. So that's me doing it for an external system. Doing it for another component is actually a little bit simpler, because the Canvas automatically creates the client for that other component. So when I have this FC component and I want to grant it a role on my R1 component, it's already created my client for this other component, and so I just go into here, and the same thing, I need to give it a client scope. So I could create a separate client scope for this component, or I could just go and say I'm going to grant that component that same scope, almost like the same business role, to call those APIs. So that's how I grant access to external systems or to other components to call APIs on my original component. And we're putting the right things in the right place. So for every component, it creates a system user for the component. The Canvas has a system user. If I want to have external clients, you create like a system user for that external client. The roles all originated in the components. The components define the roles, and so they know when they receive calls, they know what the roles mean, and you can then go into whatever identity management solution you're using, and Keycloak is just an example, and you can then assign those roles to those clients. So let's just revisit the 3 questions and recap. So what's the scope of an ODA component versus the ODA canvas with respect to authentication and authorization? So components do not include their own identity management, but instead declare their roles to be configured by Canvas into a common identity management solution. How does a Canvas get permission to call management and security APIs on a component? So it's mandatory for each component to declare roles, and those roles are applied to the CanvasSystem user. So they give that CanvasSystem the permission to call those management and security APIs. And how does a component define the roles it supports for external systems as well as other components to access? So components can either statically or dynamically create roles, and those roles are to be granted to external or internal clients or other components. So in this video, I haven't covered how you use this authorization model within a component implementation, and the team are working on some reference implementation that will show how to do this and help accelerate the adoption of this ODA model. I also haven't shown how the Canvas can configure API gateways to enforce and protect the component services. Both of these are topics for future videos. Finally, here are some links for further information on the ODA components in Canvas. If you have any comments or you'd like to contribute to this project, then please get in touch with us. Okay, thank you for your time.